So my name is Airi Triisberg. I am a culture worker and political organizer based in Tallinn. And I will moderate this discussion today. And I want to say a warm welcome to all of you. It is already our third conversation in the online event series learning about Alexandra Kollontai. And I'm very glad, as I said, that this event series keeps finding engaged publics. Before we started preparing for this event series, I was not quite aware that Alexandra Kollontai is currently going through a moment of public revival, actually. Numerous books and articles have been published about her recently. But however, when discussing some of those recent books with fellow feminists from the post-Soviet region, for example, we often find ourselves expressing some dissatisfaction because those books are usually written from a Western perspective. And our aim with this event series here is to look at Kollontai's work and life from a non-Western perspective. Most of all, we will discuss her impact in the post-Soviet region. And I should also say in the peripheral post-Soviet region, which is a bit different than Russia, for example. And another thing that I want to say that when we think about Alexandra Kollontai from this post-Soviet and post-socialist perspective, then of course Kollontai's reception is a bit more ambivalent than it is in the West, or in the way that she's being discussed now also in this moment of public revival. On the one hand, she's remembered due to her progressive role in the early Soviet period, and it is acknowledged that as People's Commissioner for Social Welfare in the first Soviet government, she played a crucial role in shaping the emancipatory gender policies of early Soviet period, which included, for example, the legalization of abortion and access to contraception, health insurance and paid leave for women after childbirth, equality for children born outside of marriage, and secularization of orphanages and secularization of marriage, and also decriminalization of sex between men. But as a Bolshevik feminist and Stalin's diplomat, she is also associated with a difficult heritage of the Soviet period, of course. And this ambivalence has accompanied our conversations until now throughout those events that we have already organized. When engaging with the writings with Alexandra Kollontai, we did not always agree with her. And discussing Kollontai's legacy constantly leads us towards discussions about Soviet legacy in general. And this process is sometimes a little bit messy because from the Estonian perspective, for example, we are not really used to discussing the Soviet period. In the official narratives, everything already seems very clear. And the contemporary leftist and feminist narrative about Soviet period does not really exist. So in the course of discussing about Alexandra Kollontai, we have started to stumble upon these issues in many ways as well. Today, we will discuss Kollontai's relation to Estonia in particular. In her autobiography, she writes that visiting the Kreenholm factory in Narva became a turning point in her political biography. And this detail about her life, as Piret Karo will present in a moment, was very well known during the early 20th century and also the Soviet period in Estonia. However, during the past 30 years, it has been completely forgotten. At the same time, Kreenholm factory has become an important site where contemporary feminist artists are working. So we will today discuss the links between Kollontai, Kreenholm factory, and feminist art in Estonia. And the conversation about these connections raises important questions about remembering and forgetting, which are again related to larger political histories in the region. So I also want to say a few words about the team that organizes this event today and the event series in general. The conversation today is hosted by Feministerium, which is a very important feminist organization in Estonia. They run an online publication and a community space, a biannual festival, and a number of different events. And I want to say a big thank you to Nele Laus, who has been supporting the organization of this event today. The event series, Learning from Alexandra Kollontai, is organized in dialogue with Joanna Esposito Yusif and Egia Insula. and organized with the funding of Nordic Culture Point. With this event series, we seek to strengthen networks between intersectional feminist and art practitioners in Nordic and Baltic region. And we are also trying to take the most out of this online format and bring together people who normally do not meet so often in person. And in fact, I am super glad that this, to see that a transnational and largely East European public has constituted itself around this event series. I think that if we would organize a discussion on Kollontai in the community space of Feministerium in Tallinn, for example, then maybe 10 people would come because it would not be a very popular topic. But this online format allows us to bring together those few people from Tallinn, Riga, Kaunas, Vilnius, Minsk, Helsinki, and so on, who are interested in such unfortunately marginal topics such as the history of feminist socialism. In order to reach out and to reach you, we have asked a number of feminist and art organizations in the region around Baltic Sea to co-host this event. And these organizations are our host today, as I mentioned, Feministerium in Tallinn, but also Museum of Impossible Forms in Helsinki, Nida Art Colony in Nida, Lithuania Social Center Emma in Kaunas, Autonomous Center Luna 6 in Vilnius, Rosa's House of Culture in St. Petersburg, and Mobile Transnational Festival Y, which is newly established here in the Baltic region. Thank you all for your support. So I will now give the word to Piret Karro, who is a curator, cultural critic, and poet, and she will present us a paper that she wrote about Alexandra Kollontai's relationship to Estonia. Some of you who have followed this our event series from the beginning, you also know that our very first webinar departed from student papers that have been written about Kollontai by feminists from both Soviet region. And that paper is actually also one of them. She wrote it at the Central European University last year in spring. And it has not been published yet, so I'm also very glad that we can present this very interesting paper to a broader public today. And Piret will make a presentation of approximately 40-50 minutes. And after that, I will ask artists Maria Kapayeva, Marge Monko, and Eleanor de Montesquieu to respond to this narrative bridge that Piret will build between Alexandra Kollontai, Kreenholm Factory, and contemporary feminist art in Estonia. And then after that, we can all discuss together. So I will now pass the screen to you, Piret.
Hi, thank you for this introduction, Airi, and thank you everyone for coming. I'm really happy to present this really interesting research I made a year ago at CEU for a public audience as well. My supervisor of that class, Franziska de Haan, is here as well. Thank you for coming, who gave me an A for the paper, so I hope I hope it will be a good presentation. As Heidi said, this is going to be, I'm going to kind of firstly create this portrait of Alexandra Kollontai, because a lot of this research is based on a biography that was written by Kathy Porter of her, and then look at the Kreenholm factory, which is a phenomenon in itself. And then arrive to nowadays when Alexandra Kollontai and her relation to Kreenholm has been largely forgotten. However, the abandoned factory territory itself has become this interesting place where a lot of feminist art has been created in the past decade. But before I get to that, I will introduce you to this dress that I'm wearing, because this is, it's called a kittel. In Estonian, there's no good translation. It's a gown or a dress. It was sent to me by my grandmother in the dark COVID times in her care package, along with jars of jam and other things a few months ago. And this is her kittel from the 1960s, sewn to her by her friend Vera in Karksinõuja, in a very small town in South Estonia. And the reason why I'm wearing this today is that the fabric of this kittel came from Kreenholm. So this is a demonstration of the 60s pattern design from Kreenholm. Okay, so I will share my screen and show you some pictures. I hope you can see it okay.
All good.
Great. Okay, so okay, let me put my timer on because I know I might go over time. So this presentation is based on the research I did a year ago, and in the first part, I'm going to quite kind of talk about Kollontai as well as Kreenholm in quite an intertwined way. So some portray her and then portray the factory and then kind of show the links there. And then in the end, I will move on to the art. So as most of us in this circle already know, Kollontai, perhaps some don't, she was born in 1872 in St. Petersburg in an aristocratic family. And during her life and political work, she became a legendary icon of socialist worker, a fighter for women's rights in Tsarist Russia and as well as internationally. Her main argument, her mother was from Finland. Her father was an army officer. She spent a lot of her summers in Kuusa in Finland. And her biographer writes how she was making friends with the poor children there in the courtyard against her mother's will, who was an aristocrat. And later on, she would also write a lot about the workers' conditions in Finland. Her main political arguments became that women's oppression within their position in the family should be abolished. She also spoke of the sexual freedom of women. She stood for the rights of women to work and have humane working conditions. She believed that the basis of patriarchy is capitalism, and in order to defeat patriarchy, women have to organize as women workers, not merely based on their gender solidarity. She was one of the founding members of Zhenodel, the Women's Bureau under the Central Committee of Bolshevik Party in 1919, which organized cultural and educational work for women and did many other things. She became one of the first women diplomats in the Soviet Union in 1922. She also published fiction throughout her life, where she would be expressing her ideological views in fiction format or in literary form. And she also did scholarly research a lot based on the working conditions of workers in Finland. And she also held speeches of women's emancipation across Europe, also in Tartu, for example. And by the time of her death in 1952, she would have become a legendary socialist woman. But at this era that we are focused at the moment, which is the last years of the 19th century, Alexandra Kollontai was a 24-year-old woman married to Vladimir Kollontai, an engineer. She was struggling in her role in her domestic role, having to take care of her little baby and to entertain his husband's colleagues with cakes and tea, as is written in her biography. And she was reading August Bebel's Woman and Socialism and realized that women struggling for their equality could find their natural allies with the workers. She was also reading Nietzsche, Marx, and Plekhanov. And she was a strong believer that women's own creative work gives meaning to her life and makes her life worth living. So at the same time, when Alexandra Kollontai was reading Auguste Bebel, the actual working conditions of women in the factories were quite horrendous. Serfdom had been abolished in Tsarist Russia in 1861, and women's living conditions often included their husbands beating them when they had gave birth to a daughter that being wept upon. Young women had to sleep with their father-in-laws. They were tyrannized by their mother-in-laws, as described in her biography. They didn't have any property of their own. They couldn't get passports. They would be afraid of getting arrested. And oftentimes they will go to their countryside, domestic places, to the cities to work in factories. And what waited them in those factories were 12 to 18 hours work days, which were unpaid during the pregnancy, even having to give birth right next to the bench in late 19th century. And the way these conditions are described in Kollontai's biography by Kathy Porter was that this was her experience. Their heads ached with the dust and fibers which filled the air, and Zoya soon felt, she was Alexandra's friend, soon felt too ill to carry on and had to leave. The workers worked up to 18 hours a day, imprisoned inside the factory walls, and were allowed out only for a few hours on Sundays. Few of them had their own living quarters, and most lived in the factory's vast dormitory barracks, with families, babies, single people, and children all stacked one above the other on narrow bunk beds or on the floor. This is a photograph of Kreenholm from 1886, so 10 years before Kollontai went there. The conditions that we just described were seen as quite modern for the time. And nowadays, when you take a walk in the Kreenholm territory, you can see all of the barracks and dormitories still there. Kreenholm was a textile mill founded in 1857 by a German cotton merchant. Its cotton spinning and manufacturing mills were the largest in the world, or in Europe and in Russia. And it was considered one of the most important mills at the time in Tsarist Russia. While being such a gem of industrial revolution, while having these very modern technologies for the time from England and Germany in the factory, it was seen as a pearl of industrialization. But at the same time, it was also it's an important thing, important location in the history of industrialization. But at the same time, it's an important location in the history of revolutions and strikes in factories. This photograph is by Marge Manko, who is with us today as well. It's a statue of the 1872 strike in Kreenholm, which was one of the most, the largest strikes there. This is for its 100th anniversary, put up in 1972. And you can see a woman in the front, because most of the workers there were women and most of the strike leaders there were women as well. In fact, this is just a note. This is Amanda Kreisberg, who has a statue in Narva, who was one of the strike leaders in an earlier strike, where afterwards she would be imprisoned and killed in a prison because of her activities as the strike leader. But this is like a women's strike leader statue is not something you will see in Tallinn. So this is very, this is something that's also, perhaps we can talk about later on, about the value or worth of history in Narva. So let's get back to that strike. It happened in 1872, which is the year when Kollontai was born. So Kreenholm's revolutionary history precedes Kollontai. It became a riot. At the time, the manufacturer employed 4,500 workers, and it included a nursery, a library, a clinic, and a school within the complex. The workers striking in 1872 were demanding, there were 500 weavers. They were demanding their working hours to be shortened from 14 hours to 13 hours, and their payment to be increased by 15%. The conditions for children to go to school to be made easier. So from nowadays standards, they're not very high demands, but from those standards, they were worth human lives. Some of those demands were met, but eventually the strikers were suppressed by the military. Several hundred of them were laid off and the leaders were arrested. Nevertheless, this had a huge impact on workers' movements in Russia. Right. So this is a contemporary photography of Kreenholm manufactory. So knowing, so now we know kind of the character of Kreenholm as this very modern factory with still horrible conditions for the workers who would strike to get their rights met. And then Alexandra Kollontai visits this factory, so you can already see how it was the center of tension within the region. So Alexandra Kollontai, her husband Vladimir Kollontai, his friends who were engineers, and her friend Soja and their son Misha went to Narva for a visit in 1896, because Vladimir was supposed to change one of the some ventilators in the Kreenholm factory. And during that visit, Alexandra experienced those sights that we heard from the earlier quote with the air being polluted, workers being exploited, children dying on the nursery floor. She was shocked. She went back to the hotel from the factory. She waited for her husband to come home, and then she would burst out to him that we need to do something. And her husband didn't understand what was the problem. He said that we did come here to change the ventilators. But Alexandra was very, very disappointed in her husband. And she said that, quote, "We can't go on living like this while other people live like animals." The engineers tried to persuade her that this was why they had come, to install a new ventilator. She retorted that she was talking about economic relations, not ventilators. So that night, as described in her biography, her husband and his friends went to the theater, while Alexandra stayed home, didn't go to the theater. After this moment, they went back to St. Petersburg. She enrolled in political economy classes at the university. She read worker strike leaflets written by Lenin. She also read the Union of Struggle newspaper, Workers' Thoughts, which criticized sexual harassment at the factories. And I think this is an interesting note, because right now when we talk about workplace harassment, we often refer back to Catherine McKinnon's sexual harassment of working women from 1979 from the United States. But in the early 20th century, women workers were already complaining about their harassing bosses in the factories. So this intersection between gender and class, women and workers, already was criticized in 60 years before this book that we now see as canonical book came out. And 2 years later, after her visit to Narva in 1898, she leaves her husband Vladimir and her son Misha, moves to Zurich, starts to study Marxist economics, and later begins underground revolutionary work for the Social Democratic Party in St. Petersburg. So this is sort of, in this part of the presentation, this is kind of sort of the happily ever after, where we leave Alexandra Kollontai for the moment to go back to Kreenholm and look at what was happening there. This is a frame from Eleanor de Montesquieu's film Vabrik from 2010 that we will talk about a bit later on. And I believe this particular footage that you're looking at is archival footage from Kreenholm factory. So throughout the 20th century, Kreenholm became a vital center for Narva. Everyone from at least a few people from every family would work there. They would work there for generations. Kreenholm would receive a Grand Prix from the World Exhibition in Paris in 1900. The number of employees would go up and up every decade. In 1911, already 10,000 people were employed. It was the biggest manufacturer in Tsarist Russia and Europe. And now we have arrived to late Soviet era or mid-Soviet era. And these are designs we're looking at from the 70s and 80s from Kreenholm textile factory. All of them have authors, as you can see, listed on the slide. And these kind of textiles in coming from Kreenholm became a dominant domestic element in many homes in Estonia and the Union. The visuals of these productions would spread across the Soviet Union on pillowcases, furniture sheets, clothes, bed linen, towels, tablecloths. They would make people feel at home. And from the 1960s on, the Kreenholm prints would become the aesthetic representation of the era. One of them you can see me wearing. But sort of the happily ever after where we need to leave Kreenholm at is the early 2000s and 2010s when when Estonia had gained its independence from the Soviet Union in 1991. So throughout the 90s and throughout the early 2000s, the workers of Kreenholm would have been laid off by the thousands. And now, if you would ask anyone my age, I believe, how do they remember Kreenholm, it's mostly through those news items they will read every month in early 2000s about layoffs in Kreenholm, because it was a long process, which ended in 2010 when the company finally announced its bankruptcy. And a lot of it was due to the fact that textile industries were outsourced into Asian countries, and Kreenholm couldn't compete anymore in that industry. This is from Maria Kapayeva's archive, group photo of Kreenholm workers, all of them wearing kittels, I believe from the 80s. And you can see the prints hanging behind them as well. So while Kreenholm was being bankrupted and closed and forgotten, Kollontai was also being neglected and forgotten in Estonian contemporary memory. So even though her news about her and her comings and goings and her meetings in different countries, her going to Mexico or to Norway, there was always some news about her doing something in Estonian newspapers in the 30s, for example, or throughout her lifetime. But in the independent Estonia in the last 3 decades, she has been forgotten. And it's interesting how in the 60s, she even though she had passed away by then, she was still remembered. And this screen that you're looking at right now is a frame from a theater play that came out in 1977, and it was broadcasted on TV in 1980. It's a story about Alexandra Kollontai. It's based on her biography. It was written by Mati Unt, who is one of the most known contemporary playwrights in Estonia. And it's just a curious thing I dug up in the research, or this curious entity so he wrote this when he was writing about, he was reading Brecht, and he was writing contemporary theater that was very much an important part of the development of Estonian theater of the 20th century. So he wrote this story about her. She is portrayed by Hilja Varem, the actress. And this is just a reminder that back in 1960s and 70s and 80s, she still was not forgotten. So nowadays, coming to the current moment, or coming to the present nowadays, right? We have mainly forgotten about I'm talking about Estonian feminist circles, so it's not very well known that Kollontai visited Kreenholm, even though there is this art that we're going to talk about today being created at Kreenholm, at the territory about the workers, engaging the workers' personal histories. The fact that this important figure of socialist, I can't say feminist because she didn't want to call herself a feminist, but socialist fighter of women's rights in the Soviet era and earlier. The fact that she went to Narva, to Kreenholm, we do not remember this fact as Estonian feminists. And that's a very curious forgetting, I think. It's a strategic forgetting. And I believe that part of it, the reason why this has been forgotten is this large wave of anti-communism that came about in Estonia once it became independent. So in the last 30 years, when Estonia declared its independence, it took this very decisive turn away from anything socialist and towards neoliberalism, because that meant freedom, independence, sovereignty, nation state, national independence. And all of these Soviet figures that used to be respected were not anymore. So I think these acts of anti-communism, while on the one hand can be understood through the trauma that a lot of people had under the Soviet regime because of repressions, because of many other things, on the other hand, it became a tool of neoliberalism to willfully portray socialism as evil in many different shapes and forms. I hope we can go into a bit more detail of this statement later. And so the question is that why is it important to remember this right now? Why are we talking about this? I think that remembering Kollontai in relation to Estonia is important because that way we can understand our own political roots and history as contemporary feminists here. It gives perspective to our own fight or to our own activism. It kind of shows who our grandmothers are. And it, I hope, also will bring in a bit more critical perspective of this liberal feminism and neoliberalist economics that we are currently swimming in. So I think now we can move on to the artists. So I'm going to introduce you to 3 artists who I am very happy are here today as well and can give their own comments. And we will talk about 3 of their artworks, even though there's a lot more to talk about. So curiously, there has been several artists in the past decade who have gone to Kreenholm and done art about the working class women there. There is Eleanor de Montesquieu and her film Fabric Factory from 2010. I hope some of you were able to see it from the Facebook event, or you can also look it up after this seminar. It's a half-an-hour video or film of archival footage from Kreenholm from the 60s and 70s, I believe, as well as Eleanor's own filmed footage from the 2000s and 2010, when these processes of the workers being laid off and the company being slowly shut down were going on currently. And this film gives a thorough historical visual overview of the rise and fall of the manufacture. It juxtaposes the archival footage of, from the Soviet era, from 60s and 70s, when the factory was working in full power, with its closure processes in the 2000s, when people were being laid off in thousands. Generations of family history intertwined with one industry, one place of employment, one craft, fading away. There were no protests, even though we know that Kreenholm is an historical location of workers' protests. And to kind of just see how this industry slowly had to give up and admit the power of neoliberalism. So I would say that looking at this artwork, the neoliberal processes in Estonia is a keyword. Secondly, there's Marge Monko's Forum 1 and 2 from 2009, which is also a video, two-part video work. The earlier images that we saw about the strike statue and about Amanda Kreisberg's statue are also made by Marge Monko, and I recommend you to go and look at her webpage to look at the different artworks that she did in Kreenholm. This is this is a video piece that sheds lights onto the intersectionalities in Estonian society. It's the first part is a remake of this very known political talk show in Estonia called Forum, which is known for mostly for, it's been going on for over a decade, having men in suits talk about Estonian social issues and politics. So in that particular part of Forum from 2008, those men in suits discuss a reform or a new working law, and its effects on the workers and on employers. And one of the things that new working law did was to make it easier for employees and employers to negotiate their conditions. And this was one of the, I believe he was the justice minister, described this as, this is what we have always wanted, to have a free state not for the daddy state or the father state to dictate what the worker needs to do, but for the workers to negotiate their own conditions. This is civil society, this is freedom. But in reality, this meant that it was easier to lay off the workers, but then it gave a bit more rights for employers to make it easier for them to lay off the workers. And I think just as a side note, an interesting thing that happens in that actual Forum show is that while those men are discussing this new law, there is this poll that is running in the one of the underage of the show, which asks, "Are you afraid to lose your job?" And listeners could call in and reply yes or no. And by the end of, and so it's quite like real time. So you can see percentages going up and down almost by the minute. So it kind of creates this adrenaline as well while they are discussing the law. And in the end, it's 72.6% yes, I am afraid to lose my job. And the host of the TV show says that, oh, this is positive because last episode we had over 80% of people being afraid to lose their jobs. So what Marge Monko did was she invited Russian-speaking women to act out those parts of those ethnic Estonian men or Estonian-speaking men, and talk the same script that they were talking in. And in the second part, they kind of come back to be themselves. I think some of them or all of them are used to work at Kreenholm, and they reflect their own emotions and feelings and thoughts about this new law. And they say that it's very hard to find a job as a middle-aged woman in Estonia, because if an employer hears how old you are and you might be 52, they just hang up the phone. And even if you go to raise your qualifications, if you go to different workshops or whatever, it doesn't raise any chances of getting a job in Estonia. So what Margaret does with this piece, in my eyes, is that she really draws out the intersectionalities or intersections in Estonian society when the Estonian-speaking men in very powerful positions, they're ministers, they're leaders of the employers' union, they have Estonian names, they speak Estonian, they are men. They are the most privileged and powerful section of Estonian society. And the Russian-speaking women, they have Russian names, they are Russian-speaking, they are middle-aged or older, and they are women. They are the most marginalized social group in Estonia. Also, if they are from Narva, then the eastern part of Estonia is also, as a territory, is also marginalized in terms of employment, among other things. And then there is Maria Kapaeva. We're going to focus on this group photo today, but in 2017, she opened a whole exhibition. The dream is wonderful, yet unclear, in Narva Art Residency, which is located in one of the buildings of the Kreenholm complex, the director's building. And I also recommend you to go to Maria's webpage afterwards and look at all of the other artworks that were up in that exhibition as well. So Maria's mother was a textile designer in Kreenholm, and she has described how when she was a child, she always dreamt of becoming one as well. In here, I think the keywords collectivity and community are important, as well as valuing older women. For this exhibition, Maria made interviews with many former workers at Kreenholm. She collected their personal archives, their photos. One of them even gifted her her diary from the time when she was working there. So the exhibition is about personal histories and narratives around this factory. And the curator of this exhibition, Liisa Kaljula, has written how the collective spirit and sense of togetherness between women is challenged by the individualist and competition-based aims of global capitalism. And she brings out that for Maria and for this exhibition and for this topic, the important keyword is Eastern European feminism, which can be described as a specific thing because, and an immediate thing, because she says that in a transitional society, the problems of many women are essentially different from those who have lived in longitudinally stable societies. So the women who experienced the abrupt change of regime in the early 90s have a whole different experience than the women who were living in Western Europe. And And secondly, Eastern European feminism is important because women of the post-socialist society have a strong historical experience of collectivity, while women living in a market economy have often had to cultivate the latter with the help of feminist theory and activism. So I think that's an important or interesting point to make about this state socialist experience in relation to feminism. And Liisa also says that these discussions that have thus far mostly been held between Estonian men cannot be regarded as being truly democratic until they contain a Russian-speaking female voice, which also links back to a forum video piece by Marge Moko. So these are the three artworks I would have introduced to you. I hope we can open up the discussion with the artists and with the participants here as well. I think I'm very looking forward to your own comments about what you heard and about your own experiences with your relationship with Alexandra Kollontai, if it exists, or perhaps any other reflections you would like to make. And I hope we can also, in the wider circle, reflect upon class issues in current feminism. So thank you on my side.
Thank you, Piret. And I would know, indeed, I would first give word to Marge Monko to respond to this presentation by Piret, and maybe also, I think my question would also be like, how do you feel in this being placed into this narrative bridge that Piret has been building? Because somehow I think also what you, Piret, were now doing is this kind of juxtaposition, no? So the question of what are those links? I think this juxtaposition kind of helps us to see links that are maybe a little bit, invisible otherwise. But I would be also very curious to hear from Marge first. How do you feel in this narrative bridge? And also, if you want to somehow also add or contextualize a little bit more about your work in Kreenholm, then feel free to do that as well. Or also, if you want, like Brad already asked, to maybe also comment about your relation with Alexandra Kollontai, if it exists.
Yes. Hi to everyone, and thank you, Airi and Feministerium for hosting this event, and thank you, Piret, for this very interesting talk. Yeah, maybe I would start with a kind of like a reasoning why I was interested or started to be interested in Kreenholm. About 13 years ago, it was 2008 when I first visited the site. So first of all, I was kind of curious about Kreenholm because part of my family, my mother's father's family was from Narva. And one of my great-grandmas worked in the Kreenholm as well. Her name was Anna Kaera. She was born in 1869, and she was working in the Kreenholm. I don't know exactly the years, but when I look at the dates when the children were born, and they were already born in Narva, so she actually, I think she might have worked there during the period of the turn of the century, and also the first revolution in 1905, which was then suppressed by the Tsarist power. And the story that has been kind of circulating in the family from generation to generation is that Anna was working in a factory. The working conditions were really harsh, and she had two daughters who were both born in the beginning of the 20th century, and she was saying that I forbid my daughters to work in the Kreenholm because it's too hard work. So yeah, that was one of my interests, and also other sides was that that there was these stories in the newspapers about closure of the Kreenholm, but there was not enough a perspective from these female workers who were actually in a very precarious conditions at that time, because they let off people gradually. And there were no voices of these women in the media. So I was really curious of kind of like seeing the situation in Narva myself. And of course, it turned out much more difficult than I thought, maybe because I'm not fluent in Russian, and it was I was like obviously an outsider, and it was difficult for me to get in contact with the people there. So I did eventually 3 works based on Kreenholm. First of them was a series of photographs, which I did in the territory starting 2008, and the photos are made during 2 years. And it's basically kind of documenting the situation. And back then it was it was very much still the condition of kind of like leaving the factory behind. So you had a lot of kind of kind of leftovers and tools and equipment there, which is not there anymore. It's all gradually like cleaned out. So the series of photos. Then later I also I went to the Estonian Film Archive, which has a kind of like really like large collection of the photos made of Kreenholm, especially during the Soviet period. And these photos are mainly been made by the photographers that were employed by the factory and by the factory's newspaper. And they have a very specific visual language, which is very characteristic to the Soviet documentary, using like specific angles and really like putting the female workers in the center of the frame. And they were they are of course very staged, but I was very drawn to this representation as well, because I mean, I have been growing up or becoming adult in the 90s, where, you know, like the figure of the worker and especially the female worker was not something that was represented at all, or like put on the pedestal or kind of presented. So I was very interested in that. So I used these images as a footage, and I made a photo film out of them, which is called Nora's Sisters, which is also on my website. And to this video, I added a voiceover, and the text of the voiceover is taken from Elfriede Jelinek's play, which is written after Henrik Ibsen's Nora, or a Dollhouse. And the scene which is depicted in this voiceover is the scene where Nora goes to the factory to warn the women that the factory will be closed soon, and there will be a new real estate development instead of this factory. So it kind of very much matched the current situation of Kreenholm. And the third work, Forum, which Piret also presented, was actually the initial aim was to invite some of the ex workers of the Kreenholm to play there, or to perform there, but as I mentioned before, my Russian is not fluent, and I really also tried with the help of different assistants, but it didn't really work out. I didn't I mean, I did get some contacts there in Narva, but all of the women refused to participate. So I came to Tallinn, and I managed to find these women, actually most of them, not all of them, but most of them, through the ads that I put on the advertisement board of the unemployment office. And they were very kind and helpful to help me out, and I was contacted by some of the women. The work was of course paid, and then some of them brought in their friends who were also at the time unemployed. So the second part where they are reflecting on their experiences of being unemployed was really something that's that they had experienced themselves. Yeah, so it was very much inspired by Kreenholm, but did not work out with the ex-employees. Yeah, and coming back to Kollontai, perhaps it was new to me when I read from one of the columns written by Piret. It was for the March 8 in Sirp, in Cultural Weekly, when Piret mentioned that actually the point of radicalization for Kollontai was visiting Kreenholm. I didn't know this fact because I'm kind of familiar with her biography, but mostly like these essays that I've read, they mentioned that she was just like visiting a factory, but not like a specific factory. So it was very interesting to me, and also my source of information where I tried to read about working conditions there in the 19th century and in the beginning of 20th century was Estonian novelist Eduard Vildes novel Raudsed käed, in Estonian. If I translate it directly to English, it's Iron Hands. And this is a kind of realistic novel that very kind of in detail describes the working conditions there. Also describing the living conditions of the workers in the barracks that Kreenholm built, and the protagonist, who is a young man coming from the countryside to work in the factory. When he gets injured, there is no social security whatsoever. This is like his own problem. Nobody takes care of him, and it has a very sad ending eventually. So in that sense, I think that the conditions for women working in the Kreenholm were like very, very different from these, like during these times and during the Soviet period, where they had all sorts of like bonuses and recreational possibilities, like possibilities to go to sanatoriums. The children had the possibilities to go to the children's camp, childcare, like all of that was really, I think. I mean, like if we think about the context, it's really something that was achieved by the Russian Revolution. I mean, however critical we can be about communism, but this is something that really changed the working conditions of the workers. Yeah, I guess I don't have anything to add. Maybe if we can kind of have a discussion or conversation, or maybe we can have it later.
I think I would now just pass on to Maria and Eleanor to also make a short response, and then we open it up. Maybe just from my side, where you ended, the last point that you made, I just wanted to add, with the important contribution of Alexandra Kollontai, these changes were achieved. No?
Exactly.
But now, thank you, Marge, for these contextualizations and comments. I would pass the screen to Maria now.
Hi, thank you. First of all, Airi, Piret, Feministerium, for inviting me. And I was, when Airi was mentioning about this idea, I want to highlight this is the first time I was mentioning her that it's the first time when Margi, me, and Eleanor are in one event. Even we obviously all knew that we were developing the work at different times on the Kreenholm. So we get together. It's great to be together here, especially. I will not have a time to brief about this whole my work. It's actually it was a kind of a long journey. A few years I developed this body of work, but I was living with that idea even longer. And in 2014, I finally got a chance to start that with the help of Narva College, who basically at that time gave me space, gave me a room where I could invite Kreenholm workers for the interview. And at that time, the lecturer of the college, Karel Vannemelder, who is now at Tallinn University, he was, funny enough, my assistant. So university lecturer was my assistant who was scanning all these photographs people brought. But we were a great team at that time, and that was very valuable help. So just kind of to say, if to talk about Kreenholm, there was a term which I can be named, called Kreenholm child. It means when the both parents work at the Kreenholm, and so I'm one of them. And obviously I go through like a kind of my family story, how the whole closure was happening, and my mother was fired, one of the first people, as one of the best workers. And my father stayed nearly till the closure in a different roles. And so just thinking, like, when I was doing research, kind of try to overview doing research, I was immediately, for example, brought my attention to Amalia Greisberg, and there is some information about her very short life in the Narva Museum, as anyone interested. So I was really wanted to highlight her story. It's again something like, you know, most of Narva people still know that name, but they really don't know what she did and how important she was. And it was interesting that in the Soviet times, the Soviets brought her as a kind of heroine because of leading the protests. But then it's eventually from 90s, the name stay, Miracle Monument stayed, I guess, because maybe it was before the really Soviet Russia times. But through my research, through my conversations, and because my work is building up through my also personal narratives, I realized that my body of work is shaping more around kind of late Soviet era. So it's kind of almost like, if we call it last generation or last generation of Kreenholm workers. So I kind of left behind the idea doing something about Amalia, but I really hope one day somebody will do that and bring her name up, brings more meaningful to that short but bright life of one woman. And And also, that's what kind of a bit referring what Margi was struggling with, not being able maybe have the access as she wanted to the community. That's what I was privileged with, having that access by being one of them, at the same time kind of being already living abroad and educated somewhere else. So that was, I guess, I found this is maybe my a point of trying to do the work about Kreenholm, and that's how interview started. And it was very interesting because I am in a way technically from a family of engineers. I quite quickly realized that my privileged position in terms of education and even where my parents work in Kreenholm, compare, for example, with the working class women who mostly came for my interviews. So for myself, it felt a bit of a pressure, but at the same time, I really was trying to develop any kind of works which these people would appreciate, and their voices would be heard. So I would not, in a way, like damage in any way with my artistic interests, what they brought me. And that's how different works like textile, video, photographic collages, that's how they all were born. And I was really grateful how many kind of stories and sometimes objects were gifted me, and so I could use them. And and speaking of this photographic work, which Piret mentioned, and it's also as a video work exists, which you can see on my website. It was sort of, I had that idea also for some time, but really like almost a week before opening the exhibition in Narva, I decided like to do that. So I call out Kreenholm workers for the group photograph, and each of them got a copy of it when they got back to the exhibition. And that was also the way to invite them to the exhibition, because for me it was really important that they would come even if they maybe never visited exhibitions in their lives, or very rarely, some of them. And I was really touched at how many of them came with their grandchildren or children and kind of start to reveal their own stories, remembering their times of work at the mill. And also just to kind of to say that this exhibition, in the end, I really felt that I could include more, especially more stories and photographs people gifted me. So I produced the book, which is with the same title. It's like somebody that's seen like this cover. You can find it also on my website, which is again with the whole fundraising I did. I made it clear that 50, but it's actually a bit more copies went for free to the Kreenholm workers. First of all, who I interviewed, and then there is some kind of Kreenholm club of former workers. They also get a copy, so they could distribute between them. And as I know, all Ida-Virumaa libraries of that region, they have a copy of the book as well. That was also very important for me to have that. So, because it's very different than once you visit exhibition legacy, I feel different, that you feel you belong to something if you see this, your faces or faces of your colleagues in the book. So for me, that was also important. And kind of starting from the previous century and finishing on a Kollontai from that the 19th century. So I mean, I knew her name before, just kind of a say, but I came across her. I don't remember, unfortunately, when that she visited was in the Kreenholm, but I think the high point was actually not already after I developed the work, is when I was with the director of Narva art residency and Miriam Vaikla. I was very involved in writing the big proposal for Narva for Cultural Capital of Europe for Narva 2024. And that's where we kind of find suddenly these connections between Nordic countries' feminism and the connection with the Kollontai and how it was influenced the strikes and protests in a kind of in Estonia and northern Russia, as I understand, they will influence also the Nordic feminists further, and they kind of was, I don't think I can say any more much because I haven't done research on that, but was kind of really suddenly you feel like that Kreenholm, not just only as enterprise economically, was very significant place in Europe, like in the textile industry, but it was also actually very important in the feminist history of the region, which I didn't know before. So, and that was kind of really, I don't know, something really special. And really, I'm really grateful that this event, for example, happening, because it can be more knowledge and thought, and people maybe can research more, even more about that. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Maria. So now, last word before we open up the discussion to Eleanor de Montesquieu. You need to switch on your mic.
Yes, done. Do you have questions? No? Okay. So I sort of answer the same questions, or Ivy. Okay. Thank you. I'm so happy to be here with you, Ivy, Nele, Piret, and Margen and Maria. It's super nice. So why did I go to Kreenholm? Like, why did I go? I mean, I started going to Narva a lot in like 2005, 6, 7.
Eleanor, I will just interrupt you a little bit. Can you speak closer to the mic because we don't hear you well?
Okay, so I started going to Narva. Is it better? Good. I started going to Narva like more than 10 years ago, 15 years ago, and filming there. And my reason was also sort of family links that pushed me to try and understand maybe what I was doing in Estonia somehow. My family was in Narva before the Russian Revolution. Like this great-grandfather was mayor of Narva, had a wood factory, and then returned to Petersburg, and then migrated to England and France. And so I strangely became Estonian in the 90s, and was very interested in understanding what it meant to be Russian in Estonia. So I went there again and again, and I still return many times a year and continue filming. And I named the whole ensemble of films and books and everything Nagrane, meaning sort of on the border. And so filming, of course, women. I film this mostly women, but I can't remember when it was exactly, but 2009 maybe. The uncle, or the brother rather, of one of those women, electrician in Kreenholm, took me with him. So it was not very legal. I mean, not very authorized to film there, but I thought I just had to, because these were the last moments. So this is what you see in the film, the Vaprik that you had mentioned. And what else can I say? So yeah, this is going on. And my last film in Narva, I made with Katja, and Katja is much younger. She was born in 92. And knowing we would have this talk today, I asked her to write what the closure of Kreenholm meant for her. And she wrote a lot about, I mean, as Marga and Maria said, the conditions in Kreenholm in the last decades before the closure were, or at least so they are remembered today, were good. And everybody would regret it, of course. I mean, well organized, they had time to rest, everything was organized for the kids and so on and so forth. I think Pirette mentioned it all already. And then when it closed, people lost the meaning of life, and she saw so many people dying, actually. I mean, committing suicide or just being ill, and their body just couldn't cope with their new life, and passed away. Alcohol, of course, a lot of drunkards, and I mean the sadness and the loss of life direction is what she wrote about. And also what I think is interesting and maybe interesting to research more today is the loss of the collective feeling. And I'm not sure whether it's been replaced by something else in Narva, but at least I haven't seen it. And it's not only in Narva. I mean, I'm living now in the mountains, in the village, and like 10 or 20 years ago, there were balls every week and so on. I mean, this notion of the collective was lost when Kreenholm closed, maybe in Narva. Yeah. And then Alexandra Kollontai is it's very interesting for me because I didn't know that much about her, and I definitely didn't know that she had been to Estonia and to Kreenholm. But reading about Inès Armand, who was French-Russian, close to Kollontai, and researching also on a great aunt of mine called Lydia Zinovieva Hannibal, who was born a bit earlier than Kollontai, but also from Petersburg. She left the family circles, married her teacher, socialist, was quite radical, and then divorced and married a poet, and returned to Petersburg in 1905. So I didn't know exactly why she returned. There's not much left, but she was a writer and feminist, and wrote 4 novels. One of them I'm working on, which is a lesbian story written in 1907. Yeah, I mean, so there's circles of women, Kollontai, Lydia Zinovieva, Inès Armand, very interesting to me. So I'm very happy to learn more about Kollontai thanks to you today.
Do you want to say more, or?
No.
Thank you. I don't know, now we have already spoken for a long time, so I would really, if somebody else wants to respond or to ask or to comment, then now is the chance to do that. You can use this raise hand function and to show that you want to speak up, and I will give you the word. Or if you want, you can also write your question or comment in the chat, or you can write in the chat that you want to say something, and I will give you the word while you think, because I don't see any hands raising at this very moment. While you think, I also wanted to respond a little bit and to maybe sort of with my thoughts from listening to all of you. Nina Lykke, please go ahead. Your mic is still off.
Yeah, okay. Well, I mean, thank you very, very much. I mean, it was fantastically interesting. I actually wanted to take the floor for a brief moment because I actually published a biography of Alexandra Kollontai together with a Danish group of socialist feminists in the 1970s. And so these Nordic connections are very close to my heart. But one thing that I really wanted to bring up was I mean, related to what Pierre said about this neoliberal erasure of these histories of these, I mean, people like Alexandra Kollontai, which I think is very important. And I wanted to, one of the things that we very much focused on when we did that biography and published some of her works, etc., was also the fact that she was, I mean, she's known today as having been part of the Cenotdel and part of the revolution and part of the Bolshevik party. However, one very important thing was also that she was one of the first to actually protest I mean, the authoritarian Leninist way. I mean, the workers' opposition, which was well on the agenda already in 1918-19, and she was part of that. And she was also part of the Menshevik party before the revolution for a very long time. So she was in a way deeply critical of the authoritarian part of socialism. And I think it's, I mean, I think when somehow rethinking these issues, I think that part of her yeah, well, ideology is also important. And I think it perhaps also has something, I mean, I also think that there is an important relationship to the women workers and to the, I mean, therefore also to Kreenholm, and I mean the textile workers that were very much, I mean, well, the women avant-garde of the revolution, or I mean, core of the revolution in some ways. And I think that there is some kind of women's tradition, what we might call feminist tradition, which somehow tried to think socialism differently than the very patriarchal and authoritarian and anti-democratic Leninist, Stalinist, etc. way. And I think that's an important part of the history as well. So I just wanted to bring that aspect.
Does anyone want to respond to that? I actually, because I like, for us, it's the third time now to gather around Alexandra Kollontai, and also to ask ourselves this question of what does it mean also to think about her from this sort of post-Soviet and post-socialist perspective. And I think what you were also now saying rightfully about her being in the workers' opposition and being sort of in the opposition and the critical voice is very true. And I often read it, especially in this Western literature, but in our case, in our conversations, this question of complicity has also come up.
Definitely.
Of her as you know, as Stalin's diplomat, and somehow I have the feeling that like especially like discussing about Alexandra Kollontai from Estonia, or like from like one of such contexts, it comes up a little bit more strongly, or a little bit more sort of, it's a bit more present.
I mean, no doubt about that. I've also, I mean, very much into the whiteness of Marxism and the authoritarianism of Marxism, and that issue of complicity totally important. It was just, I think that to rethink that history, I think this other aspect needs to be taken into account.
But maybe another, does somebody want to intervene while you don't and still think about how to about your comments or questions? I was also, Nina, what you were now saying, I think for me also what I take from this paper that Piret was presenting most of all is this question of like, how did we forget? And I think this question of sort of forgetting and remembering is crucial here. How did we forget? And also to notice, like, when did we forget? Because it is a very specific moment of this sort of transition. it is in the past 30 years that we have forgotten about Alexandra Kollontai, but it's not only about Alexandra Kollontai that we have forgotten. There is also this whole sort of Kreenholm, no? And its role in the workers' movement, in the capitalist movement. It's sort of its prominent role in 19th century when Piret was presenting, sort of mentioning the strike in 1872, if I now remember correctly. And that's another of these sort of uncomfortable, an example of this uncomfortable histories, because of course also the Kreenholm strike was something that was instrumentalized in Soviet propaganda. So that's maybe also the reason why we do not find a way how to relate to it, because there is already this kind of reaction to it, no? And then why I appreciate again the paper by Piret very much is that the research that you have done that opens up this question that we have not managed to answer until now in the course of this event series, is the question like, how did Alexandra Kollontai then actually influence, for example, Estonia and the development of feminism in Estonia, or in the Baltic region, or in other sort of peripheral Soviet contexts. And I think the fact that you have traced up what has been published about her is the first step. My next question would be still like, who was she in contact with? Because she visited, we know, she was traveling around, and we also know that there was this internationalism of the time, this whole also this 1905 revolution that forced people into exile, and many sort of revolutionary thinkers and activists, they met in sort of different locations and were in active contact with each other. So I think for me that would be very interesting to know. But maybe something to catch up a little bit from the discussions that we had before, when in the first event, when I asked also this question, then I think interestingly what came out is that very likely we do not find Alexandra Kollontai's influence on the development of feminism in Estonia, for example, because she did not identify with that. She only used this word feminism in order to describe this kind of bourgeois liberal suffragette movement, from which she distanced herself, actually. So it's maybe more like, if we want to look where we would find traces of Alexandra Kollontai in Estonia or in the Baltic region, then it's probably more into the social democrats. And maybe like one more point that I wanted to bring up is now in relation to this art production that has happened in Kreenholm, around Kreenholm in the recent decade, a little bit more than we were now discussing these works from the perspective of gender and class primarily, but I think there's another, because there's another point that I want to make is the fact that also the history of the Russian-speaking population in Estonia does not turn up as an object of research, and the works of the three of you in Kreenholm, but also in the case of Eleanor and Maria in particular outside of it, is one of those, are those rare examples where artists actually deal with those histories. And I think that the lack of narratives about how and what has happened with the Russian-speaking population in the past decades, is even more invisible than the history writing about women's histories or something. And I think that's also like a dimension that needs to be seen in this constellation here. These were the comments that I wanted to make. Does somebody want to respond now?
I could say one thing. I think, Airi, what you just said is very important, and I'm happy that you brought it out, and I hope that we can go back to it in this discussion. I just wanted to return to what Nina was saying, and I'm also very honored. I feel that you're here. I'm happy that you're here. It was that I think the argument that you made about this Alexandra Kollontai opposing the authoritarianism in the party, I think that's a very important thing to emphasize for us in these discussions that we have right now and have been having in this event series on Kollontai. Because I think that it brings in the nuance that we need in order to discuss or justify for ourselves that why are we talking about Kollontai? Because us in Estonia, we're still very much swimming in this sometimes internalized anti-communism, and we feel sometimes even guilty for even bringing or like we feel guilty for looking at the Soviet history of Estonia from some other perspective other than this super anti-communist perspective. So in one of the earlier seminars, we had this question coming up, or we discussed this question of what are we doing? Are we trying to rehabilitate the horrible repressions that happened under the Soviet regime? And I feel like that's a very tender spot that a lot of us have. So in order to even kind of get over this cramp of even talking about this, the legacy of the Soviet era in Estonia, we need to emphasize things like Alexandra Kollontai's stance against authoritarianism, because otherwise she would just fall into this pigeonhole of her being a Bolshevik and us therefore not having anything to do with her because we want to distance ourselves from the Soviet legacies. So thank you for emphasizing that, and I think it's a very important thing for us to include into our discussion.
I think, can I just add? Yeah, I mean, it very much comes from my my kind of interests recently, and I think I wanted to kind of like emphasize this the two notions like free love and reproductive rights that I think in the 1920s implemented by not implemented by but very kind of much advocated by Kollontai. I think this is something that is I think very important to her legacy, and this is also something that's that I think women here in Estonia also kind of or how the conditions of the Soviet women differed from the conditions of the women in the West, where the abortion was legalized, yeah, like in different countries, different times, but at the end of the 60s and in France, for instance, in the 70s. So I think this is a very important legacy. Of course, like we know how these reproductive rights were also kind of like practiced here, and the quality of the medicine was I mean, not very good. We all know that, you know, the conditions of like having an abortion was were really harsh, but I think this is still something that's, you know, like these rights were still something that's very much like part of her legacy, and I think it's very, very important.
The word is now for Katrin.
Well, I just, you know, had to go back to thank you so much everybody for presentation, but how do I remove raised hand first of all, Airi? How do I remove? Oh, okay, it's gone already. Excellent. I just wanted to go back to the first meeting, and because I kind of felt that what Piret was saying was referring back to what we were discussing during our first meeting, and also the point was raised by me and also by Sasha. And well, first of all, of course, Kollontai was earlier, she was part of a Menshevik sort of section of the party, and she also already had conflict with Lenin. But, you know, as Airi has emphasized in her introduction, and which is also historical truth. She went along with the Stalinist regime. That's what she did. The same Stalinist regime, which was at the same time, you know, killing a lot of her friends, and also, you know, this was something she was also herself afraid of meeting and going back to the to Moscow, which is something which I touched upon in my presentation. But what I wanted to say basically was that it's not about that we would be afraid to discuss historical figures, but what is important to understand is precisely that at least Estonian feminism and the history of Estonian feminism has, you know, has very different examples, and also very different foremothers, actually, whom we also don't know. And this has been the whole history which was erased, and it was erased actually during the Soviet period. This is because feminism as a movement did not exist during the Soviet period, because official standpoint was that women's situations had been resolved automatically by resolving the class issue. And that was actually also Kollontai's official position, which, you know, she was presenting in her public talks. And also she agreed to disbanding of genotels in the early 30s. I mean, she was already living in Norway, she was already ambassador, but basically she kind of officially went along with this rhetoric. So basically the whole history of feminism, it's not just that we've forgotten Kollontai, the history of Estonian national feminism, which has very different figures and also examples from the Nordic feminists, because it developed along different lines. This all was erased during the Soviet era. And of course now Kollontai is an exceptional figure, precisely because she was a Soviet political figure, and also she didn't identify herself with the Western feminism or feminism as a movement per se, and therefore, of course, she was known as a figure of a Soviet-style gender equality, which obviously, you know, which opposed itself to the women's movement as it developed in the West. And the official position was that the feminism is a Western problem, precisely because it's a bourgeois. You know, it's very similar actually what Kollontai said and what was still, you know, post Second World War official view on feminism. It's a Western issue because the women's problems have been solved in the Soviet Union. Therefore, it doesn't need women.
Katrin, we lost you. Unfortunately, can you still hear us? I think she has frozen. Can you hear us, Katrin? I think we need to mute her because there is this. Did she disappear now? I think she fell out of the.
Yeah, she fell out now.
She fell out of the room.
Yeah, before it functioned.
But the points that she was making were very relevant. Yeah. Does somebody else want to still contribute with comments or questions? Somehow I have a feeling that many people have already also left, because I have the impression that these summer evenings are not very attractive for Zoom events anymore. So we could also slowly start to wrap it up. I have the feeling that we do not find the answer to the question, why did we forget and when did we forget? These are maybe questions to somehow keep in mind also in the perspective of the coming conversations, which we plan to continue in the autumn season. We will also now take the summer break, and in autumn we will organize a few more events on and around Alexandra Kollontai. One of them that we still